Sign or go to a nursing home, my son demanded. They never expected what I signed that day. My son slid a stack of papers across my own kitchen table and told me I had two choices. Sign the house over to him, or he'd have me packed into a nursing home by the end of the month. He said it like he was offering me a cup of coffee. Calm, bored almost. My name is Ruth, I am 77 years old, and I want to tell you that I did sign something that day. Just not what he thought I signed. By the time he figured out what I'd actually done, it was in front of the whole family, and there was nothing he could do about it. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes older women don't have any fight left in them, stick around because I am about to prove you wrong. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and down in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one of them, and honestly, hearing from all of you is one of the best parts of my week now. Alright, let me take you back to where this whole mess started. I raised my son Roger mostly on my own after my husband passed when Roger was 19. I worked 31 years at a school cafeteria, saved every spare dollar, and paid off the little house on Larkspur Street with my own two hands, if you count signing 1,000 payroll checks as hands. That house was never fancy. 3 bedrooms, a porch that creaked in the summer, a lilac bush out front that my husband planted the year we moved in. But it was mine. Paid off free and clear 11 years ago. I remember standing in the kitchen the day I made that last payment, just me and a cup of tea, and I cried like a fool because nobody could ever take it from me. I should have known better than to think a piece of paper could stop a person who wanted something badly enough. Roger is 51 now. He's got a wife, Carol, and they live about 40 minutes away in a bigger house than mine, one with a pool they never use and a mortgage I know for a fact keeps them up at night, because Carol let it slip at Thanksgiving 2 years back after her second glass of wine. Roger works in something with insurance I never fully understood what, and Carol doesn't work, hasn't in years. They have one daughter, my granddaughter Emily, 24 years old, sweet as anything, works as a veterinary tech and barely makes rent. Emily is the reason I kept my mouth shut about a lot of things for a long time. I didn't want to make waves that would land on her. About 8 months ago, Roger started coming around more. First I thought, well, isn't that nice, my son wants to see his old mother. He'd bring groceries I didn't ask for. He'd sit at my table and ask about my knees, my blood pressure, whether I was getting dizzy on the stairs. I thought it was kindness. I found out later it was inventory. See, Roger and Carol's finances were worse than I knew. Roger had gotten himself into some investment that went bad, lost a good chunk of money that wasn't really his to lose, and the two of them were staring down the barrel of losing their own house. And somewhere in there, my son looked at his elderly mother living alone in a paid-off house worth more now than I ever imagined it would be, and he did some arithmetic that broke my heart when I finally understood it. The first real sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday in March. Roger showed up without calling, which he never did, and he had a folder with him. Not groceries this time. A folder. He sat down across from me, didn't even take his coat off, and said, "Mom, we need to talk about the future." I said, "That sounds ominous for a Tuesday afternoon." He didn't laugh. He opened the folder and started talking about my age, about how the stairs in this house weren't safe, about how a woman my age living alone was, in his words, a liability waiting to happen. He said he'd been looking into some retirement communities, very nice ones, he said, with activities and meals included. He had brochures. Actual glossy brochures, like he was selling me a cruise. I told him I was perfectly capable of living in my own home. I still drove to the grocery store myself, still tended my garden, still hosted the neighborhood ladies for cards every other Thursday. My doctor had told me just that January that I had the blood pressure of a woman 20 years younger. Roger's jaw got tight the way it used to when he was a teenager and didn't get his way. He said, "Mom, it's not really up for discussion. Carol and I have talked about it and we think it's time." I said, "It's my house and my life, Roger. I don't recall putting you in charge of either one." That's when he slid the second folder across the table. Not the brochures. Papers. Legal papers. He wanted me to sign the deed of my house over to him, to make things simpler, he said, for when the time comes. He also had power of attorney documents in there, ones that would let him make my financial decisions for me. He framed it all as protection, planning ahead, being smart. I looked at those papers for a long moment, and then I looked at my son, 51 years old, sitting in my kitchen in his nice coat, and I asked him plainly, "Is this about protecting me, Or is this about your money troubles with Carol's house? I watched something flicker behind his eyes. He didn't answer that directly. Instead he said, and I will never forget this sentence as long as I live, Mom, you can sign this now while we're all being reasonable, or I can start the process of having you declared unable to care for yourself, and then you won't have a say in any of it. Sign or go to a nursing home. Those are the two doors you've got. I sat there in my own kitchen at my own table, in the house I paid for with 31 years of ladling mashed potatoes onto lunch trays, and my only son threatened to have me declared incompetent if I didn't hand him everything I had. I won't lie to you and say I didn't cry that night after he left. I sat on my porch in the cold, wrapped in the quilt my mother made me 60 years ago, and I cried until I didn't have any tears left. Not because I was scared of losing the house, not exactly. I cried because I finally understood what my son thought of me. Not as his mother, as an obstacle, as a line item. But I want you to know something about women of my generation. We were not raised to fold. My own mother buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children through the Depression without ever once asking anybody's permission to keep going. So I sat there that night, and somewhere around midnight, the crying turned into something else. Turned into clarity. The next morning I called my oldest and dearest friend, Dottie, who I have known since we were both 18 years old working the same diner counter. Dottie's late husband had been a lawyer for 40 years before he passed, and Dottie herself still had sharp instincts and an even sharper Rolodex. I told her everything. She didn't say, "Oh honey," or "I'm so sorry," the way people do when they don't know what else to say. She said, "Ruth, get dressed. We're going to see Mr. Whitfield on Monday morning." Mr. Whitfield had been Dottie's husband's law partner, semi-retired now but still sharp as a tack, still practicing part-time out of a small office above the hardware store downtown. I sat in his office that Monday and told him everything Roger had said to me. Mr. Whitfield listened without interrupting, the way a good lawyer does, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something I will remember until the day I die. He said, "Ruth, your son cannot force you to sign anything. Threatening to have you declared incompetent when there's no medical basis for it isn't just wrong. It can be considered a form of elder coercion. You are of sound mind, you own your home outright, and no one can take that from you without your consent." Then he asked me a question that changed everything. He asked, "What do you actually want to happen to that house, Ruth? Not what Roger wants. What do you want?" Nobody had asked me that in 8 months of Roger circling my kitchen table with his folders and his brochures. I sat there and I really thought about it, and I realized I already knew the answer. I thought about Emily, my granddaughter, who used to sit on my porch steps as a little girl shelling peas with me every summer, who still calls me every single Sunday just to talk, who never once in her life asked me for a dime. I thought about how she was struggling to make rent on a veterinary tech's salary, while her own father was out here trying to strip his elderly mother of her home to cover his bad investments. I told Mr. Whitfield exactly what I wanted, and he smiled and he said, "Then let's draw it up properly." Over the next several weeks, very quietly, without a word to Roger or Carol, Mr. Whitfield and I put together a plan. First, we established, with a full medical evaluation from my own doctor, clear documented proof that I was of sound mind, sharp memory, no cognitive concerns whatsoever. I actually scored better on that cognitive assessment than the nurse said most people half my age do, and I'll admit I felt a little proud walking out of that office with that piece of paper in my purse. Second, we set up an irrevocable trust for the house. Not in Roger's name. Emily's name, my granddaughter, with specific protections built in so that the property could never be sold, mortgaged, or borrowed against until she turned 30, and so that it could never, under any circumstance, be used as collateral by anyone else in the family, meaning Roger couldn't touch it even if he tried to lean on Emily the way he'd leaned on me. Third, and this was Dottie's idea, we scheduled a family dinner. My birthday was coming up at the end of the month, and every year without fail, Roger and Carol hosted it at their house, more for appearances than out of any real warmth if I'm honest. I decided this year I would let them host it. I would let Roger think everything was proceeding exactly the way he wanted. I played along beautifully, if I do say so myself. When he asked gently but pointedly over the phone whether I thought more about our talk, I told him I was considering it, that I needed a little more time, that I didn't want to rush a big decision. He seemed satisfied with that. Patient even. He thought he'd already won. He had no idea I had already signed everything 2 weeks earlier, sitting in Mr. Whitfield's office with Dottie as my witness, both of us grinning like a couple of girls who just gotten away with something in high school. My birthday dinner came. 12 of us around Roger and Carol's dining table, including a cousin of Carol's, a couple of neighbors, and thankfully my Emily, who drove 2 hours after a full shift at the clinic just to be there for me. Roger made a toast, said some nice things about family and legacy, the irony of which I had to work very hard not to laugh at. Carol had made a lemon cake because she knew it was my favorite, which was, I'll admit, a genuinely kind gesture. And it did make what came next a little harder for her, though not for Roger. After the cake, after the coffee was poured, I stood up at the table. I told everyone I had an announcement since we were all together, and since it was my birthday, I figured there was no better time. I said that I had been thinking a great deal these past months about my house, about my legacy, about what I wanted my life's work to mean once I was gone. Roger sat up a little straighter at that. I could see it in his face, that little flicker of victory, like he thought this was the moment I was finally going to announce I was signing everything over to him. Instead, I reached into my handbag and pulled out a folder of my own. I told the table that I had finalized the future of my home on Larkspur Street. I said that the house, the one my husband and I built our whole life around, the one I paid off with 31 years of honest work, was now held in an irrevocable trust in my granddaughter Emily's name, protected until she turned 30, unable to be sold, mortgaged, or touched by anyone else in the family under any circumstance. You could have heard a pin drop in that dining room. Roger's face went through about 4 different colors. He stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over and he said, in front of everyone, Mom, what is this? We talked about this. You said you'd think about it. This isn't what we agreed on. And I looked my son dead in the eye, in front of his wife, his daughter, his neighbors, and Carol's cousin, who I'm sure got quite the story to tell at her own next dinner party. And I said, Roger, we never agreed on anything. You gave me an ultimatum. Sign the house over or go to a nursing home. Those were your exact words to your own mother at my own kitchen table. I chose a third option you didn't put on the table. I protected what I built, and I put it in the hands of the one person in this family who never once asked me for anything. Carol had gone pale and quiet, staring at her lemon cake like it held the answers. Emily, bless her heart, had tears in her eyes, and she reached over and grabbed my hand under the table, and she said so everyone could hear, Grandma, I didn't know any of this. I promise you I didn't ask for this. And I squeezed her hand back and told her I knew that was exactly why. Roger tried to recover, tried to laugh it off, told everyone I was being dramatic, that of course he'd never really meant the nursing home comment, that I must have misunderstood him. But I had brought one more thing with me that night. A single sheet of paper, a written record I'd made the very night it happened, dated, with the exact time and the exact words he'd used, because Mr. Whitfield had told me to write everything down immediately while it was fresh, just in case. I didn't need to read it aloud. I just set it on the table next to my empty cake plate and let it sit there. Roger saw it. He knew exactly what it was. He didn't say another word for the rest of the dinner. I won't pretend the weeks after that were easy. Roger didn't speak to me for almost 2 months. Carol called once, tearfully, to apologize, and to admit that she had genuinely not known the full extent of what Roger had planned, that she'd known about their money troubles but hadn't realized how far her husband was willing to go. I believed her. I still do. We talk sometimes now, just the 2 of us, and I think in some strange way that dinner was the thing that finally forced her to see clearly too. Emily, though. Emily is the real gift that came out of all this. She started coming by every single week, not because she has to, not because there's anything in it for her beyond what was already protected, but because she wanted to. We sit on that porch, the same porch I cried on that cold night, and we talk for hours. She told me once that finding out what her father tried to do broke something in her trust for him, but it also taught her something about the kind of person she wants to be. She's already told me she wants to go back to school eventually for veterinary medicine, real veterinary medicine, not just as a tech, and I told her that when that day comes, this old grandmother is going to be sitting in the front row cheering louder than anybody. As for Roger, he did eventually come around a little. Not to apologize outright, my son has never been a man built for that kind of humility, but enough that we speak now, holidays are civil. He even came by last month to fix a leaky faucet without being asked. I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we were before, and honestly I've made my peace with that. I loved him enough to raise him alone for 32 years. I don't owe him the deed to my house on top of that. What I know for certain is this. I am 77 years old. I still garden every morning that the weather allows. I still host my Thursday card games and my knees are just fine, thank you very much. I live in my own home on my own terms, and when I am gone, that home will belong to a young woman who never once tried to take it from me, who earned it simply by being kind when kindness cost her nothing but time. My son thought an old woman alone in a house was an easy thing to move around like a piece on a chessboard. He learned the hard way that being underestimated is not the same thing as being powerless. If this story meant something to you, if you've got an Emily in your own life, or if you've ever been the person somebody assumed wouldn't fight back, I want to hear about it down in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, tell me your own story if you've got one to share. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because I've got a lot more where this came from. Thank you for sitting with an old woman's story tonight. Means more than you know.